Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Okay, see how we're doing with the IT. First of all, a couple of thank yous to Edward, the technician, who's done a challenging job getting my slides up on screen, and also to the guys who got me here, because my flight was cancelled this morning, and they were able to get me a flight at almost no notice at all. So it shows that from the pager operation all the way through to navigating the British Airways website, there's nothing Mossad cannot do. And it's a real pleasure to be here in the Netherlands, especially in September, because as a former paratrooper, the town of Arnhem is holy ground for us. So it's always a connection between my regiment and the people of the Netherlands. It's always difficult to follow Louis, because he preaches a message of conciliation and peacemaking. And I'm going to talk to you about war and lies, which is about as far from his message as you can possibly get. So not only did I serve in the army, I also studied for degrees in law, in war studies, and in psychology. I'm going to try and blend those three things together slightly. I'm not going to go too much into the law, because you have an incredible professor speaking to you next, who can do a far better job than I can. But I'm going to try and give you an idea of the two wars that Israel has fought since 7th of October. The first war, is that working? Sorry, my clicker's not working, Edward, apologies. Has it worked? Okay, we're good, thank you. So after 7th of October, the first war was the urban battlefield, and of course the 7 fronts all around Israel in which they were fighting, but I'm going to talk specifically about Gaza. But the second war, I think, was the information battlefield, and that involves quite a bit of psychology. So I'm going to try and explain to you how that has worked over the last 2 years, and some of the things that have gone right and some of the things that have gone wrong. But first I'm going to start with a video. This is going to be exceptionally challenging watching. It's a clip from 7th of October, but I think it is something that is important because it helps us to remind why this war started. Is that working? No, annoying. Can you press spacebar for me, please? No worries. No joy? Okay. The important thing to remember here is the scale of the atrocity that happened on 7th of October. And it is really important because to go to war, you need something called a casus belli. We've got it, yeah? This just shows you what happened in Israel. It's a small clip of hundreds that you can find. Okay, Hamas live-streamed their own work. I think the first important point to note is there is no moral equivalency whatsoever between what is happening in Gaza now and what happened on 7th of October. There is a real keen pressure in the sort of social media sphere in the wider world to say, well, Hamas only killed 1,200 Israelis, so how can you possibly justify the number of deaths that have happened in Gaza? Okay, one is a legally fought war of self-defense. The other was the naked, wanton slaughter of civilians. Okay, these two things are absolutely not the same. But after this surprise onslaught, the IDF were thrust into brutal urban warfare. And it's the first war that was live-streamed. That's never really happened before. We're getting footage from Ukraine. We see this footage coming over various social media channels. But it's not the same as in Gaza, where they have that media system set up to try and weaponize and misconstrue the ugliness of war. War is uglier enough. It doesn't need people to take it and twist it into something that it isn't. But perception has been the second battlefield. So I'm going to first talk about the war itself on the ground. I think it's important because there are so many lessons that we can learn from what the IDF has achieved in Gaza And there have been significant achievements. Hamas as a fighting force and as a strategic threat to Israel is almost entirely defeated. And we're seeing the very last remnants getting mopped up as we speak. There is no opportunity now for them to repeat the monstrosities of 7th of October. But they have achieved some significant things. The first one I would talk about is what we call transformation in contact. And those of you who have served in the military will know that that is the hardest thing you can possibly do. It's like akin to building the plane in flight. So an example might be the tunnel network. The initial operations underground were quite slow and cumbersome and took a huge amount of time. I spoke to the commander of one of the Israeli divisions who'd fought through Gaza. They fought through Khan Yunis, Major General Goldfuss, and he was very clear that they can now maneuver underground almost as quickly as they can above ground. And they've perfected what we call combined arms, so they are able to move troops above ground and below ground simultaneously with all the supporting fire support assets, coordinating ISTAR, which is things like drones in the sky, your eyes looking down, and even, manipulate the battlefield so that when fighters pop out of certain tunnel entrances, there are ambushes waiting for them. This is a remarkable achievement, and it happened because they set up an underground headquarters midway through one of the key city areas. This is a very difficult thing to do, and it's a masterful achievement by the IDF. They also have a learning system, so when we see things like the tragedy of the WCK kitchen incident, the speed at which the IDF were able to come up with a report, an investigation into what happened, and hold people who made mistakes accountable. There's no other armed force in the world that has that set up, good to go, ready to throw into action at a minute's notice and make sure that when things do go wrong on the battlefield, then they get rectified and changed. And not only did they do this report, but they also cascaded the learning throughout IDF headquarters across the army to make sure that it wouldn't be repeated. And then there's a make-do situation. The logistics in Gaza have been surprisingly challenging, given that it is, from halfway along the Philadelphia corridor in Rafah, you can look over your shoulder and still see Israel. Formations have been brought together, so they've had infantry and armor working together. And of course, if you're an armored brigade and you have infantry attached, you might not be normally set up to logistically support that infantry, and they've had to kind of create systems which mean that people can get fed and watered, or that supplies for the tanks can get back in time. And being able to do that and encourage your lower levels of command to take these decisions and make stuff happen and then learn from that is really impressive as well. So the IDF has delivered a masterclass in how to fight a war as well as improve and get better throughout the conflict. We're also seeing all-arms teams. So let's talk about the Merkava tank, the main battle tank for the Israeli Defense Forces. In traditional combat, you would use infantry at range from a tank in a city. So you'd push your infantry far out so that they can provide protection against someone with an anti-tank missile, that sort of thing. Now, the Merkava's APS, Active Protection System, is a defensive system that intercepts an incoming rocket. It's so good that actually now the Israelis are able to bring their infantry in closer to the tank, which gives the infantry more protection and make them a more effective combat fighting force. This is down to Israeli technology, Israeli inventions. And when we're looking at the threat to Europe that we all face from our east, this sort of equipment is going to be life-saving for our soldiers when it comes to the crunch with Russia. And that's one of the key reasons why Israel is such an important partner from a military perspective. And we can talk about technology, we can talk about mass, we can talk about how they've used special forces in a way that's not really been done by the West. They've integrated special forces units from being the guys with all the cool kit who have to have their eyes blacked out in photos, and they've integrated them so they use them as reconnaissance for their regular formations. That's not something that Western armies really do. And when we look at these urban environments that we might have to fight in Eastern Europe, in the Baltics, again, these are really important lessons that we can take forward. And then finally, let's talk about the D9 Dozer, which is a very cool bit of kit that you can see on the screen. Okay, it's an armored bulldozer, and it's been used in a radical way in Gaza, from everything from pushing logistics around through to clearing IED belts, And they even have remote control versions of this. So it's almost like an armored bulldozing drone. Again, not something any other army in the world has or has tried to do yet, and it's a massive lesson that we can take from Israel. But Israel hasn't got everything right, and it's very important that we acknowledge that so we can learn those lessons as well. Of course, the 7th of October intelligence failure is the most critical one, and I think that is widely understood across the IDF, and only in the last 48 hours we've seen them announce some of the intelligence improvements that they've made as a result, particularly in visual imagery and the use of satellites. And we have to address the presence of civilians as well. And something that is hugely underreported in the West is Hamas's human shield strategy. I would go one step further in our terminology. It's a human sacrifice strategy. And when you raise this with critics of Israel, they'll say, well, of course they're fighting amongst the civilians. That's what insurgents do. They did it in Afghanistan. They did it in Iraq. They did it for ISIS. Not like this. Not like this. Just in the last few weeks, when Israel has been trying to evacuate civilians from Gaza City before their divisions roll through to try and attack the Hamas positions there, we've seen a number of things from Hamas. We've seen them announcing false humanitarian areas for people to flee to. We've seen them forcing people not to evacuate. We've seen them doing everything they can to persuade people to stay in Gaza City. Why on earth would you do that if you were the government of a country and you knew an enemy force that massively outmatched you was on its way to fight you? There's one reason and one reason alone, and that is that they want civilian casualties. We've seen this time and time again. Okay, and when you look at the death toll in Gaza, 65,000 people is a huge, huge number. Most football stadiums in Europe don't hold 65,000 people. The British Army only has 69,000 soldiers serving in it. But then you have to consider that at least half of those, I would suggest, are Hamas fighters. 25,000 is the figure the IDF are giving, but I would suggest it's probably more. On top of that, Hamas have fired, we've seen they've put videos on their own Telegram channels of the Al-Qassam brigades firing mortars in built-up areas. A mortar round is not guided. A mortar round is what we call an area weapon. The round goes out of the barrel, up and down, and you have no control over where it lands other than doing your mathematics to work out trajectories. Okay, and when it goes bang, there is a huge kill zone on a mortar. It's not an accurate piece of kit. And we've seen Hamas firing that, so we know they must have killed some civilians with their own fire. We know there haven't been any reports of natural deaths in Gaza for the last 2 years. There's a very strong chance those are in that 65,000 total. There's the people that Hamas themselves have executed, and they've put videos of that online as well. Okay, so this 65,000 figure is totemic, but my goodness, there is a lot more nuance in there than has been widely reported in the world's media. There's also heavy destruction in Gaza, and those images that we've all seen pushed over social media and the press are horrific. I went into Gaza for the first time with Professor Korn. He was there too, and I knew what was coming. I'd seen the footage myself, but even then, as you crest the rise midway along the Philadelphia corridor and the expanse of destruction opens up in front of you, even as a hardened soldier, I was quite shocked. Okay, but then we look at why. There was a 4-month pause between Khan Yunis and Rafah. It was imposed on Israel. They wanted to go sooner, but there were huge humanitarian concerns, and you might remember the All Eyes on Rafah campaign that came around in sort of January to April 2024. Well, guess what? Hamas used that pause. They looked at how Israel had been operating in the other cities in the Gaza Strip. Israel was going in, they were sending in squads of troops to clear houses to make sure that there were no enemy troops inside those buildings. So they knew the Israelis would probably do the same thing in Rafah. And so what they did was, there are 57,000 tunnel shafts in Gaza. In Rafah, the troops I spoke to said they were finding a tunnel shaft every other house. And in almost every one of those tunnel shafts was a bomb with a camera pointed at it and with the cables going back down into the tunnels. So when IDF platoons entered these buildings, they would detonate the bomb and kill and injure large numbers of Israelis. And that happened right at the start of the Rafah campaign. And so again, the IDF adapted. And they first of all sent in a drone. If the drone didn't find anything, they'd send in the dog. And if the dog didn't find anything, then they'd send in a sort of a half squad of 4 soldiers, no more. Okay, so continual adaptation and a game of cat and mouse. But when you have every other building IED'd, bombed, with a bomb inside it, you've got two options as a soldier. Option one is what we mostly did in Afghanistan, because it wasn't quite as kinetic. It was a very different kind of campaign. And that option is you call for your explosive ordnance disposal, EOD team. Okay, and you'll be sat there for a while. You'll be guarding the place you're in. The EOD team will turn up. Clearing an IED is a very meticulous and challenging thing to do, especially when it's operated by someone watching you on a camera. Okay, almost impossible in the situation the IDF found themselves in Rafah. And yet, the other option is to destroy the building, destroy the bomb, and destroy the threat. And that's what the IDF have done. And I guarantee you, the British Army or the American Army or the Dutch Army would do nothing different in the same situation. But that's why the damage is so horrendous. It's because Hamas have turned these cities in Gaza into living booby traps. Again, never gets reported. It's just presented as the Israelis bulldozing buildings for fun. And I can assure you, having seen it with my own eyes, that is not the case. And just to emphasize the human shield strategy, this is a statement from 2008 from Al-Aqsa TV. We desire death like you desire life. Hamas is a nihilistic death cult that has thrown the people of Gaza under the sword to achieve their own political ends. And if you don't believe me, believe the words of one of Hamas's own leaders. Now, why on earth would a government of a country do that to their own people? Well, that leads me on really to talking about the information warfare campaign. Okay, this is about strategic propaganda. Excuse me. Okay, while the IDF fought with tanks and infantry and planes, Hamas was waging war against Israel with images and narratives. From day one, Hamas showed a sophisticated information warfare strategy. They understood that they couldn't defeat the IDF on the battlefield. Of course, Hamas and the Al-Qassam and the Al-Quds brigades have AK-47s, RPGs, anti-tank missiles like the Cornet. Okay, but this can't compete with the scale of Israel's first world highly technological army. So they tried to win against Israel in the court of world opinion. And I would suggest to you they have. By carefully crafting an underdog versus oppressor narrative, they cast themselves as the plucky resistance movement, manning a beleaguered Gaza, and they painted Israel as a cruel and unrestrained Goliath. Of course, this narrative completely ignores Hamas's own brutal massacre of Israeli civilians, but it proved powerful to many people. Hamas media units on the ground, and they had twice the size of a media unit as the IDF had. Okay, under Abu Ubaidah, who was killed about a couple of weeks ago, they had about 1,500 media operatives within the Al-Qassam and Al-Quds brigades. Every squad from Hamas that went out on the ground had a cameraman with them. And that camera would be live streaming. So it would go back to their headquarters. And so even if that squad got wiped out on their mission, they'd still have footage to push out to the world and spin as propaganda against Israel. And of course, if the guy with the camera gets killed, that's even better, because now Israel's just killed another journalist. And if you look at the number of journalists killed in Gaza, of the 250 that they've named, we know that at least half of those have direct connections to Hamas and allied militants. The evidence is right there, but the world doesn't choose to report it. And we've even seen fabricated content. We've seen pictures repurposed from Syria. We've seen pictures repurposed from, ironically, of all places, Yemen, which prior to this war was, and still remains, one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. And then, of course, you'll probably be aware of the images of children with congenital diseases who are presented to give this idea that somehow there was a famine in Gaza. And look, I've been to the Humanitarian Foundation sites. I've seen a distribution with my own eyes. I've met Gazan children. Yes, they're hungry, but no, they are nothing like the famine that is portrayed. Hamas were incredibly quick with their propaganda, and that was one of their really key skills. Within minutes of an explosion in Gaza, a highly partisan account would be circulating. They used media messaging, emotional propaganda, and lies as strategic weapons to weaken Israel's international support. And it's worked. I think that's something that we should face head on, and the repair that needs to be done to Israel's reputation is going to be a challenge for the next generation of politicians in Israel. But Hamas attempted to effectively achieve through narrative what they couldn't achieve on the ground, and that was to paralyze Israel's campaign and turn the world against it. They certainly succeeded in the second part, less so, fortunately, for Israel in the first part. So how did this go on the world stage? Well, tangible effects on global perceptions, and you don't need me to hammer this point home because you will have all seen it over the last 2 years. Around October the 7th, I think many Israelis were surprised at how fast sympathy was lost for October the 7th. Within almost days, people were claiming genocide. Before even Israel had started their campaign, Israeli Holocaust scholar Raz Sigal pushed out a paper saying that there was a genocide in Gaza. This is before a single troop had crossed the border into the Gaza Strip from Israel. Everyone's seen those heart-wrenching photos of wounded children and flattened neighborhoods and desperate hospital scenes saturated with blood. And here's the thing, it doesn't matter if the image is real or not. It's about a cumulative effect. And it's exploiting me, it's exploiting you, it's exploiting everyone that's seen it, because you would have to be inhuman not to be moved by an image of a small child covered in dust, or someone holding the body of their dead child. This is a human thing. But unfortunately, this is what happens in war. This is why you don't start wars unless you have to. This is not a bug. This is a feature of human existence. We've been at war with each other since the first caveman came out of his cave and tried to take another caveman's territory. This is a feature of human existence. But it's the first time in human history that we've had phones where you can just scroll. And if you think about how you look at social media, it's just a thumb flick. Okay, and that plays into, and Hamas understand this, plays into the fact that we don't have time in our days to critically analyze everything we see online. If you see a photo of a child from Gaza, you don't have time to go, is it actually, I'm going to go and do an image search on Google here, is that from Syria, is it from Gaza? What's the context to this? What was the target of the bomb? Was there collateral damage? Now let me do a legal assessment of that airstrike. You don't have time to do all that. And so you react emotionally. Okay? And an emotional reaction is very difficult to reason someone out of. And that's why the Israeli method of just trying to explain stuff hasn't really worked. And I'll give you an analogy. I'd like you to imagine that you're in a fight with your partner. You're having an argument. And just as the argument's getting extremely heated, you say, calm down, you're being irrational. How's that go? Okay, you know exactly what I mean. Trying to explain your way out of someone else's emotional reaction psychologically doesn't work. And that's been the real challenge, I think, for Israel's messaging. People see children, see them hurt or hungry, have an emotional reaction where they're angry at what they perceive as the person who's responsible, and for the person responsible then to sit down and start talking you through the law of armed conflict and collateral damage estimates and rules of engagement, that's not going to cut it. So really, really tricky, and Hamas understand this, and they have weaponized it. We can also look at how they've manipulated international narratives, depending on which bit of the world we're talking about. So for the Western Hemisphere, they focus on the suffering of children and try and weaponize our empathy. In the global South, they've weaponized the language of colonizer versus oppressed. So you'll see they very much frame it in different ways depending on who they're talking to. What they've done is their audience analysis. There's no accident here. This is a really clever, really well-implemented strategy that has had many, many years in the making. We can date it back to possibly 1964. And Yasser Arafat's sort of rebranding of Palestinians as suddenly a new this country that has always been there, where it never really was before. Before that, Palestinian referred to anyone in the area. And if you look at the badge of the Palestinian football team prior to the independence of the State of Israel, it had a Star of David on it. So, this was a new narrative that came around in the 60s. Soviet-backed, focused on the left. And there's a reason that the harder left in Europe are so passionate about Palestine when they're not over any other topic or any similar war. None of them get upset about the 500,000 Christians who've been killed in Nigeria, which, the numbers in some countries in Africa, look at Sudan, dwarf Gaza. Gaza isn't even the bloodiest war of the 21st century. It's not even close. Syria was far worse as well. Okay, so it's a massive totemic issue for the far left because they were the focus of Soviet-backed propaganda operations against their fellow travelers and fellow sympathists in the West. It's also, of course, been amplified by some of those countries as well. Russia has hugely amplified it. Qatar, through Al Jazeera, as Loy said. Iran, Pakistan has huge numbers of bot farms as well. So sort of Hamas's fellow travelers have also helped them amplify and explode this message worldwide. And the reason, of course, Gaza gets more attention than Sudan or Nigeria or Yemen is because Gaza has this incredible international state backing for their propaganda campaign. But could Israel have done anything different or better? And this is the really tricky part. First of all, Israel is hugely outnumbered, hugely outgunned financially when it comes to this PR campaign. We might suggest they were slow off the mark, taking 12, 24, even 48 hours to rebut false claims, by which time the narrative's already gone around the world. And the best example of that is the Al-Ahli hospital bombing. Okay, well, I say bombing, of course, that's the narrative, but it wasn't a bombing. It was a dropped short Palestinian Islamic Jihad missile. That's been proven beyond any real question. But unfortunately, you'll see the New York Times there, they ran 3 headlines on the same day as the story emerged. Okay, and of course, how can you rebut something in real time when you're a democracy that values truth? You need to understand what the truth is before you can come out with your version of the story, by which time the narrative is already set. Incredibly difficult to do. We could suggest perhaps that Israel has underutilized the evidence available to them. I still don't think the world fully understands 7th of October. Now, I'm a professional military analyst. I was on an awful lot of Arabic and kind of similar affiliated Telegram groups on 7th of October 2023. I was in Frankfurt to watch my beloved Indianapolis Colts playing NFL when my phone exploded with this horrific imagery coming out of Israel. But you speak to people in the streets, they don't realize just how appalling that was. And since then, I've been, I suppose, unfortunate enough is the word, to go to Israel, to be shown evidence from 7th of October far beyond, frankly, most Israelis, including the evidence of the rapes that were committed that day. And even now, it's difficult for me to talk about. It's the single worst thing I have ever seen in my life, including anything I saw in 3 tours of Afghanistan. And I won't go into details, but it's horrific. Okay, now, I'm not suggesting that Israel should have shown all of that to the world, but I think there is a debate to suggest that perhaps the 47-minute video could have been more widely released, but then, of course, it could have been weaponized. So there's a really tricky, nuanced debate here. It's not easy, because the difference is Hamas is set up to spread their lies and spread their propaganda in an instant, whereas Israel is trying to fight a war of national self-defense to make sure that 7th of October can never happen again. Okay, and I'll draw a line there, but I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think you succeeded to talk about a very complex and big topic, but give all of us a lot of information also from your experience as an officer in the military, but also what you've seen, of course, in Gaza and in Israel. And I'm sure there are going to be questions, so I would actually like to open the floor directly for questions from the public,
Questions from the audience?
from the audience. We have here.
Get back. 1 second, I'll come to you. There we go.
Yes, privileged to listen to you. I was wondering whether you have perspective on how social media algorithms help to pollute the information streams on these things.
Yes, I've got a very, very strong opinion on this, and I've been doing quite a bit of writing on it over the last 48 hours, so you've timed that question beautifully. I'll give you the 10 euros later. Thank you. But look, I call this the unenlightenment. We're living in the unenlightenment, where there is what we call a dilution of epistemology. Okay, expertise is no longer valued in the way that it was, because everyone's got an opinion. And people now have so much information that they can access worldwide, but also lack the critical ability to analyse a lot of it. So I'll use an example of an airstrike in Gaza. Okay, if you've never served in the military, you don't know how an airstrike like that works. You don't know that it's driven by intelligence, that there's a whole targeting cell with lawyers attached who look at the target, and you'll probably soak it for a while with intelligence to try and develop a picture of a pattern of life and work out what your likely collateral damage is if you drop something on it. And then you analyse what the best round to drop is, what the best munition you might drop is. And only then, and once you've done that whole process, do you then pull the trigger and destroy whatever you're trying to destroy. Okay, all people are seeing is these horrible images and going, my God, that's awful. No context at all. And the algorithm is designed to push that outrage. Okay, clicks drive revenue. So the more outrageous something is, the more attention-catching it is, the more likely it is to explode on social media and make a lot of money for the social media companies. Okay, and that's a real problem, because it means when we come to disinformation and we come to false imagery and false narratives, there is no incentive for social media companies to do anything about it. And that is a real problem that I think needs policy guidance to actually get around it, because these companies aren't going to do it themselves, and people aren't going to come off social media because they're addicted to the serotonin that comes with getting likes and clicks. But yes, it's an incredibly difficult thing.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline. I have a question. Those people with radical ideology are entering Europe. Europe is falling. That's the truth. I don't feel safe as a woman walking at night at the streets in Rotterdam anymore. What can we do to stop this? What can we do to change maybe the asylum law?
I mean, that's probably one more for Loy than me. But look, I mean, it's not my area of expertise, but if you look at how the tensions in our societies are exploited by social media, that's probably something I can give you. Where rather than try and find common ground in areas where perhaps we can better assimilate people from different cultures and different religions and different kind of ethnic backgrounds, we tend to fall into these social media traps where malign actors such as Russia will absolutely drive those divisions. And that's probably the first thing we have to overcome before the politicians can find an answer that I don't have for you, quite frankly. But there's a really interesting phenomenon happened during the Iran war with Israel, when there was the direct confrontation where Israel went in and took out the nuclear facilities. And it relates to Scottish independence. Okay, there were a bunch of very, very prominent Scottish nationalist ex-accounts that went completely silent whilst Tehran was getting bombed. Okay, it's very clear that our enemies are using social media and using the splits in our society to drive that wedge further between us. And so from my professional expertise, the first thing we can do to fix that problem is fix the issue of our enemies who are absolutely trying to subvert us, and make sure that assimilation doesn't happen. Make sure that compromise doesn't happen. Make sure that that people can't live together happily in our countries. And that's not the answer to your question, because I don't have it. But I think that is the very first step that needs to happen.
More questions?
Wait. What is it? Okay.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for your service, Andrew. It's a pleasure listening to you. If we're looking at the relative success of, my name is Alain, the relative success of our enemy's PR campaign, I've had the absolute honor to work with a think tank, and they pointed to me the Russian influence of psychology warfare and the visible psychology warfare, which has quite a lot of similar tendencies of how Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, and so forth are having their psychology warfare. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and see if there is indeed that the fact that that is similar and that they may have been educated by the Russians on this front? Thank you.
Yes, of course. No, I think it's undeniable that we're seeing the fingerprints of the Soviet Union to this day. A large part of the problem, I think, is that our enemies understand us incredibly well, and we don't understand them at all. You know, how many people in Europe, outside of specialist students, actually speak Arabic or Russian? Very, very few. You go the other way around, though, and they have a proliferation of English language speakers. And one of the reasons I did my psychology master's is because war is fought by people. So if you can understand the people better, you can understand the war slightly better, was my theory. That kind of worked, I think. They've understood that for a very, very long time. They understand that emotional reactions are much quicker than critical thinking. Okay, to go into brain chemistry, when you see a horrible image or something traumatic, it fires off your amygdala, which is one of the caveman parts of the brain. It puts you into fight or flight mode. It floods you with adrenaline, it floods you with cortisol. The physiological effects of those hormones, they narrow your vision. Your body wants you focused on the threat, not on stuff on the periphery. It pulls blood from your brain to your arms and legs, so you're ready to fight or run. And most importantly, it actively suppresses your prefrontal cortex, which sort of sits about behind your forehead. Obviously, mine is much bigger than most people's. But that is where your critical thinking happens, in your prefrontal cortex. And yet, by showing you a horrifying image, I'm actively suppressing your critical thinking. And this is why I've spent a lot of time training army officers. That's one of the things that's hardest to train, is how to get people to think critically when they're in incredibly high-stress situations. And it's that kind of reaction that our enemies understand and exploit. And I go back to the argument with your partner metaphor. You know, it's very, very difficult to bring someone back around from a conclusion they've reached from an emotional reaction, because there's no rationality to their original position. You know, I hate Israel because I'm horrified because they killed the child that I've just seen on social media. Like, how do you reason someone out of that? How do you change that mind? And our enemies fully understand that that's how the empathy in the West works. It works very differently in places like Africa. I worked with the Kenyan paras, our sister battalion in the Kenyan army. And when we did, company attacks, they didn't care if the beeper vest went off, that signified they were dead. If they took the objective with one soldier left alive, they were delighted and thought that was a huge success. For us, that would have been an absolute catastrophe, and I'd have probably been sacked if I'd taken my company through an attack like that. But, the world doesn't think in all the same ways. And if you go to Ukraine, where I've been on the front lines down in Pokrovsk in the last month, the Russians think incredibly differently to us. But they get us, they totally understand us, and they manipulate and weaponize that.
Thank you.
More questions?
Thank you. Yeah, it's working. Andrew. I think we have room for one or maximum two, but we have to be very short.
Two, I would say, yeah.
Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. Andrew Tucker from Think. We're looking at international law issues. One of the remarkable things is the way that the international courts have been sort of weaponized in all of this. A few months prior to October the 7th, there was a request for an advisory opinion on the territories. Immediately, South Africa initiated its genocide case, a whole raft of cases. I'm wondering what information you have about how premeditated that was, how planned it was, that the courts would be used as a weapon, a media weapon, an information weapon in this war.
I mean, I'd be speculating. I have seen some suggestion that there's evidence that Iran and the ANC in South Africa met in the weeks in the run-up to 7th of October. So there is a suggestion that we don't know what they talked about, we don't know what was said or agreed, but it seems slightly suspicious. Likewise, the organisation of some of the protests that happened on 7th of October, well, I say protests, celebrations that happened, were suspiciously well coordinated as well. So I think there was a degree of forethought that went into this, and especially when it comes to that information campaign I spoke about. And when it comes to the ICJ case, again, we see with these legal actions and this lawfare, and I'm sure, I don't want to steal Professor Corn's sandwiches, because he's probably got quite a bit more to say about this than I do. When it comes to these international cases, actually the end result doesn't matter. It's unimportant, because this is an information campaign. It's enough that you can say Israel is being taken to the ICJ for genocide. That's all you really need. When there's legal terms thrown around as well, like plausible, okay, it doesn't mean what people think it means. Legal words sometimes have very strange and different meanings to what we would expect, and plausible, genocide was never said, and yet that is something that you hear all the time. So it's a really tricky thing. In terms of concrete proof for connections, we can't give it, but we can certainly look at the outputs, and we can make an assessment with Occam's razor as to whether it's more or less likely that they were coordinated, and I would suggest that they almost certainly were.
Major, I'm a lawyer, and
I'm so sorry.
yes. For you, the good news might be that I'm also a Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserve for the Royal Netherlands Marines.
My apologies, sir.
Standard is, Major. I'm also trained in urban warfare, and with the Royal Marines, special operations. And my question to you, sir, is, and that's a question I get a lot here in the Dutch press, what is for you the decisive point when you decide to have an airstrike on a hospital, killing all the inhabitants, the doctors, the patients, etc., versus taking out a hospital or the underlying tunnels with the infantry? In other words, what is for you as a military officer the test when you switch from an infantry attack on a hospital, thereby diminishing the collateral damage for the building as such and its inhabitants, say the civilians, the non-combatants, versus taking down a whole hospital with an airstrike? And that's something we here in Europe don't understand. From a military perspective, maybe it's different. So what is your experience with your operations? What you as a commander would say, for now on, I'm not bringing the infantry, but I decide for an airstrike to take out a whole hospital?
I mean, the law of armed conflict around protected sites is very specific, and there are only very few certain circumstances where you could airstrike a hospital if you wanted to. I don't think Israel has struck with an airstrike any hospitals in Gaza, to my knowledge. They've certainly hit tunnels outside hospitals. They've certainly had operations like the second Al-Shifa operation, where they've cleared a hospital because Hamas were using it for military purposes. But I don't think they've hit any hospitals with an airstrike. That's a fairly common misconception from the disinformation that's being pushed out. But look, it all comes down to risk and legality. They're the two things, they're the two conditions that I would look at if I were in that position. First one is, do I have any legal grounds whatsoever to fight in or attack this hospital? And we saw a mistake the other day, I think. There was the incident at, I forget which hospital it was, but they fired 2 tank rounds at the hospital. Hard to justify. And I think there's some hard questions that tank commander has to ask, or be asked, I should say. But look, also mistakes happen in war, and that's just the thing. Humans are fallible. And Israel is the only army in the world that is expected to be perfect 100% of the time and never make a mistake. So park that aside, though. But I would then, once I'd worked out whether I had any legal grounds to operate in the hospital, I would do a risk assessment. You would look at the scale of the threat that's inside the hospital. You would look at the chances of your own troops coming out alive. If you had good intelligence that that hospital was heavily IED'd, then you might strike it. But when you balance it against the law of armed conflict and what you're allowed to do in those areas, I would say almost 10 times out of 10, the odds are that you would put your infantry in there rather than airstrike it. And that's why I suspect the Israelis haven't struck any hospitals with airstrikes. It's because legally that's just not justifiable. And I've been in Israeli Air Force targeting cells. I've watched their targeting process. They do exactly the same as we do. It's the same process. And actually, they have more lawyers looking at it than we normally would. Genuinely, they do. And that's not a Jewish joke. It's just a thing. They genuinely have more lawyers than we do. Okay, so, you know, as has Professor Korn, we both looked at how the Israelis do stuff, and he's far better at this than I am. But we're, you know, I'm speaking for you here, sir, but we're both content that the Israelis are following the correct process and doing things legally.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thanks, sir. Lovely.